Webinar today is about the continuum of gender-based violence in forced migration communities. And the speaker, Urooj Mian, is the Chief Executive Officer of She Associates, Inc. And I will introduce her in a minute. I'll first start with a small introduction about QED, the Kazaz Education Development Fund. And we're hosting this webinar because QED builds, connects, and empowers individuals and communities to foster equity of access and outcome. This is done through innovative education development programs that are rooted in values of human rights, democracy, and social justice. Some of the roles QED plays is it bridges the service gaps between service providers and disadvantaged communities. It provides an online platform for refugees and service providers. And the e-learning, it is the e-learning partner for the nonprofit sector. It delivers its programs mostly in a hybrid model, which customizes programming around e-learning modules. And it encourages community participation and engagement. In addition to all that, it has parallel research work where it serves as a community connection to the research community. So it fills that gap as well. And all programs are run in partnerships with other organizations in different sectors. If you'd like to learn more information about QED, please visit the website. It's http://q-ed.org. That's q-ed.org. Thank you very much. And now on to the topic that we'll be discussing today. So refugee women face many forms of vulnerability throughout their forced migration journey. This results in multiple forms of insecurity and violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, SGBV. So SGBV can take unique forms. Even upon arrival of the country of resettlement, there remains very real gaps in authorities truly applying a gender lens to their work to formally identify and adequately address the unique needs of refugee women throughout their journey. Using the human security approach, this webinar will introduce participants to the varying vulnerabilities, threats, and risks refugee women face to prompt examination of the continuum of violence persisting over their lives before, during, and after their flight for safety. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Urooj Mian as our speaker today. Urooj she holds a research of Masters of Social Science, M.Sc, Peace and Conflict Research from Uppsala University in Sweden. She also has a Masters of Law and LL.M in International Crime and Justice from the United Nations Interregional Crime Research Institute, the UNICRI, and the University of Torino, and a Bachelor of Public Affairs in Policy Management, where she specialized in human rights and law from Carleton University in Ottawa. In Canada, Ms. Mian worked for almost 10 years with the Government of Canada in the Strategic Advisor in Policy and Programming, which included the operational implementation for over $360 million in funding in programs targeted towards newcomers and refugee populations. She contributed as a woman, peace, security, and international gender expert nationally and abroad. Most recently, she was invited to the United Nations University for Peace as an expert visiting professor, where she developed and delivered a master's course titled Gender in Peace Building and Human Security. From 2014 to 2016, Ms. Mian was the first ever executive director and president of Women in International Security Canada, which she incorporated and established as a federal not-for-profit. Here, she was also the chair of the first ever Canadian platform for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence Canada, where she chaired for 2 years. Today, her latest endeavor has brought into fruition her passionate commitment to enact tangible changes in the field of international development, particularly in gender, justice, peace, and security worldwide. With her firm, Sustainable Human Empowerment, She Associates, Inc., she is the Chief Executive Officer. Thank you very much, Urooj, for taking the time to be with us today. We're very grateful and we're looking forward to this. Please, the mic is yours and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Perfect. Thank you, Dahlia. First of all, I'd like to say and offer a big thank you to Khalid and his team at Al Kazaz Foundation, and specifically Tina and Kother as well. There are some phenomenal individuals behind the scenes working to impact the lives of some of the most vulnerable in our country. And I believe that you all are fueled by a passion for innovation in impacting lasting change. And that combination is so, so powerful. So I'm grateful I can be a part of this journey with you today. Before I begin, I like to say, just a little bit about how I think, that I don't believe that there is just one recipe to peace. There isn't just one recipe to security. There isn't one recipe to justice. And although there are some fundamentals for all of this, fundamental components, there is a need to recognize differing contexts, capabilities, and challenges. And in order to do this, it's important to be able to be conscious of a different side of things, or look beyond the status quo, or even critically question what is, so that we can evolve towards something better, so we can recognize, frame, and evaluate the issues towards solutions. Much of what we teach or preach as gender and justice practitioners has so much to do with our everyday lives, the ways in which we live, the structures and systems in which we function, and the rules and values which we hold dear. They're all part of a bigger picture, and they're all components that feed into each other, allowing for the human relations that we practice or perceive and project to exist as they are. So I hope in participating this morning, you're able to walk away with a little bit of a renewed or refreshed perspective, and the motivation to critically understand the systems in which we carry on with our everyday lives, and in your own way offer or enact some change. So thank you for everyone that's joining us on your weekend, on your Saturday. And I'm really looking forward to embarking on this important conversation together. So I will share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to be setting up a little bit of a conversation where we'll be able to discuss some basic concepts on the continuum of gender-based violence and forced migration. So very quickly, I will talk about what is forced displacement, the technical aspect of it, how it's legally defined. We will talk about the core concepts that I'd like to talk about when we're talking about refugees, when we're talking about gender, and we will use the human security approach to frame this, and it'll all sort of come together as to why. I'll also talk about what I perceive as the continuum of violence in the migration journey, and the touch points in areas that need attention that are gender specific. And then we can end off with the solutions and next steps and discussion. So just a little bit of a background. Today, UNHCR figures as of June 2018, there are 68.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. You can see this on the infographic. Of this, 40 million are internally displaced and 25.4 million are refugees. When it comes to breaking down the numbers on the amount of women, it is disproportionately higher, and some statistics state that over 80% are women and their dependent children, which will explain why it's problematic to put that category together, but it gives you a sense of the dire need out there right now to recognize the specific needs of these individuals. So forced displacement, what is it? According to the 1951 Refugee Convention, a refugee is defined as a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail him or herself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. So the key piece here is a refugee is defined as someone fleeing for their life outside the borders of their nation. In contrast, internally displaced person. It's a person or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, and natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized border. So forced flight, what does it mean? I'm going to use the word flight when people are fleeing. It's forced, it means it's not by choice. And that is what we will talk about when we talk about the migration journey. So quickly on how I'll frame this, the migration journey breakdown. We'll talk about impacts in the pre-flight stage. So when their situation is dire, when there's violence and there is this need to flee for life. So during the armed conflict, in presence of the armed conflict. Then during the flight to safety, so the actual fleeing, which then leads to in-country or countries of first asylum across that continuum. So what this means is, even if you're running and you cross a border, you might not end up staying there. It might be the first country of asylum, but it might not be the permanent area that you end up in. Often we know in refugee settings, this is a very protracted situation for many. For example, the Congolese situation, protracted for 8 to 10 to 12 years, people have been living in camps. So this would be sort of a camp setting, or would be a camp setting. And then we have the country of resettlement, where individuals are permanently resettled because there isn't an ability to return, or they have received refugee status and are being resettled. And in Canada, we call them newcomers. So we have our refugees come settle in Canada, and they're newcomers with PR status, permanent resident status. Core concepts. So what I want to do is break down a little bit what it means when we're talking about gender rights, when we're talking about equality, when we're talking about specific needs. What does that mean? So I'll break down a little bit on what we mean when we say gender and all the sort of concepts that surround that, so we're able to then technically apply the human rights and human security lens to the situation that we're going to be talking about. Gender, what is it? So the way that we define it is that it's a social construction that frames societal expectations of roles of men and women, including expected behavior. These are often fueled by gender norms and roles. These differ context to context, perhaps. There's universal ones. What is feminine? What is masculine? What is female expected? What is male expected? But it is all reinforced with that social construction and reinforcement that takes place. So what we say about that then is that it's learned. It's not necessarily a biological fact. What, for example, would be a gender role? In many countries, women are cooking, they're at home, they're taking care of children, and don't go out and work, for example. We also say that gender is a dynamic and fluid concept or social construct because it can change and differ through time. It can change and differ through context. A gender role here in Canada may be very different from a gender role across the ocean on the other side of the world, maybe in Southeast Asia, for example. There's a really explanatory quote that I have here. Judith Butler is an academic, and she sort of breaks down what it kind of looks like when you're talking about gender roles. She says, we act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. So what are roles? Again, it's those expected behaviors. They're implicit and unquestioned rules. You see it in your households when you're with your family. It happens in all levels of education. It's reinforced by media, by culture. There's appropriate and inappropriate, right and wrong, and customs, tradition, culture, etiquette. It all preserves gender relations and reinforces these gender roles. So what does it mean when we're talking about equality? When equality exists, it is a condition that results in the same rights, access, and opportunity for men, women, boys, and girls. But it does not mean sameness. It means that differences are recognized, that unique needs and differing needs for accessing the same opportunities are addressed. What does that mean? That means that when there are barriers to accessing those needs or those opportunities, that those are also addressed. We talk about where the placement of an individual and where they're beginning to achieve the same thing. It does not necessarily mean that they need the same thing to obtain the same job, for example, or the same opportunity. When we talk about a gender perspective or lens, we now begin operationalizing gender, as we term it. How do you look at something with a gender lens? And when we're looking at something with a gender lens, we're not necessarily looking at it as a female lens, for example, which is often what is understood, that gender is all about women. No, it means what is the social construct that is existing, at what we're looking at, what are the societal conditions, how do we look at something so that we make sure we're able to aspire and achieve equality for everyone. So to do this, you need to know what the gender differences are and how they have been included or not included in formulating policies, measures, actions, rules, laws. And when we're talking about a gender perspective and applying that gender lens, we are referring to the inclusion of women's views and considerations. So because historically and structurally, this is the demographic that hasn't been included, we do forward that in our advocacy that there is inclusion of women's views, opinions, needs, considerations, especially when we're talking about situations of armed conflict. Like I said, male views have traditionally been treated as universal, and that is something to always keep in the back of your mind or forward when you're looking through anything with a gender perspective. And a gender perspective complements and strengthens traditional approaches. For example, there may be a process, like a peace process taking place. What are we looking at? We're looking at inclusion. We're looking at women's participation, for example, or like I said, the varying impacts of each different diverse group. It doesn't need to be just women that you're looking at. Within vulnerable populations, there can be, different dynamics. It can come from social class. It can come from, even just age, differing needs depending on different groups. Gender mainstreaming. So this is actually the operationalization of gender in policies and processes. This is where we're talking about actually applying the attitudes of gender equality when you're planning and forming and implementing rules, basically. It needs to be systematic and institutional. I basically call it policy in action, but it's a concerted policy in action where you are making sure that equality is first and foremost and a priority, and that means that gender is. So it's a process and action of integrating gender equality while also addressing discrimination. And there's two main steps on how you can gender mainstream something. So one is the legislation, like we talked about, of policies which will guarantee equality, equal rights, and right to diversity. So make it the rule. Make that the status quo. And then while you're going through existing structures and processes, analyze implementation of measures set by these laws to further the culture and attitudes of gender equality. There needs to be a cultural shift when you're looking at gender mainstreaming. There needs to be a new way of looking at things and a renewed sort of understanding. So this is a term that I often use. I find it very helpful and I've sort of just formulated it on my own. But when I talk about gender in practice, I'm really talking about gender consciousness. And when you're talking about consciousness, you're really talking about awareness, and being ever sort of aware and actively aware. So when we put all these concepts together, you're practicing gender consciousness. You're understanding, you're using a lens, you're identifying and critically assessing gender roles, and your ultimate goal is to achieve gender equality while mainstreaming gender, right? So that's one method of it, but it's a very systematic, structural method of it. So I've defined it as the practiced awareness and mindfulness of the inherent difference in human experience based on socially determined roles and relationships between men and women. It is demonstrated when specific interests, needs, and barriers of women and men, boys and girls are actively acknowledged and addressed in developing society. And its foundational aim is to achieve equality for all. So the human security approach. One of the main components of discussing, one of the main foundational reasons for discussing human security is to address insecurity, right? And so when we look at insecurity, we're looking at what is causing the insecurity. And when we talk about refugee context and armed conflict context, we're talking about vulnerability at the end of the day. And so when you're applying a human security lens or approach, which is it's a formal technical approach, which we'll talk about, you're really looking at what are the vulnerabilities, and we'll break that down. But I have a picture here that you can have a look at. I have the caption here. It's a refugee camp in Syria in 2014. It's a Palestinian refugee camp in Syria before the exodus was extreme from there. But what do you see? And I'm not going to break down what I see at this moment. We're going to come back to this picture. But there is emotion that you can receive from just looking at this, and there's a lot of activity going on. And what is the vulnerability there? What do you see? Who's there? Who's moving? Where are they going? What's the background? Why? So what is vulnerability? It can be defined as the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. When we talk about security, and especially when we're talking about international security, where the refugee sort of paradigm has come into play, we often think about it in a traditional notion. It's usually national security, and when we talk about war, we're talking about armed conflict between states, or the state obviously plays a big role when there's a civil conflict as well. But the concept of human security is, in terms of its formalization, is quite new. And we basically say that there's a recognition of a new paradigm of security. And when we're talking about humans, we're talking about individuals, right? So this new concept is now looking at how do we merge old and new security threats. And there is a recognition that we need to move beyond the traditional responses, for example, military aggression. What that means is move beyond the traditional understanding even of what insecurity is. Insecurity could have been, post-Cold War, it's been shifting, but it was conflict and wars between countries, and the protection came from military, and nations' priorities were the nation itself and its prestige and its success. And a threat would be another state, for example, but that is not the case today. It's, most of the world is dealing with civil strife where there is conflict, and it's not traditional in any sense. And we are still analyzing and learning as conflict experts on what the dynamics are, and trying to put it into frameworks so we can address them. And this is one approach. So the human security approach does say that a comprehensive approach is required. And that means that there needs to be an interdependency between development, human rights, and national security. There's an acknowledgement that there is a connection. When we talk about the human elements, like I mentioned, we're talking about individuals, and the actual technical formal approach is very interdisciplinary. So the concept looks at 5 key areas. One, it's people-centered. So individuals are the center of analysis. It's not necessarily the state this time. We're going down to what we call the bottom. It's a bottom-up approach. How does the insecurity of individuals affect the overall piece of the broader picture? It's multi-sectoral. So we're understanding that there's broadened understanding of threats. Threats can be economic, they can be political, they can be more than just complete military aggression, for example. We understand that it's comprehensive, that you cannot practice, assess, and address human security in isolation. Cooperation between different entities, different elements is required. And we also understand that context matters, that it's context specific and prevention oriented as well. So here we go. When we're looking at types of threats: economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, political. There's so much, right? So for example, let me pick one out. If we talk about food security, what does it look like? Hunger, famine. And when we start applying the gender lens, there's extra questions that you'll start asking. How does hunger affect a woman? How does hunger affect a mother? How does hunger affect a pregnant woman? How does hunger affect a child? How does, so what you start doing is you actually get into the details of the situation. And you cannot, with the human security approach, use a broad brush to address the issues. So I'm going to skip over this. So as I mentioned, it's a pretty new approach and is formalized in UN policies, which you can look up. It was only in January 2001 that the UN recognized human security as a necessary concept to address security threats, current and modern security threats, sometimes they're called. And the goal of it is to protect the vital core of all humans in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment, the essence of life. So, like I mentioned, what is gendered security? That's precisely what it is. It's human security. It's individualistic. You're using a bottom-up approach. It's linked to justice and freedom. Justice is important because it's a foundation of society, rule abiding, accountability for abuse. It's comprehensive. It also questions the role of states as adequate providers of security. Look at IDPs. When people are internally displaced, they are not necessarily being protected by the state, and sometimes they are being attacked by the state. We can look at the Myanmar example for just one idea. And it looks beyond the status framework. So again, the accountability does not necessarily lie with the state. Vulnerability revisited. So I want you to just take 2 seconds to take a look at this picture and now think, where are the women? And what does vulnerability for a woman look like in this situation? The continuum of violence. So very quickly, when we're talking about the continuum of violence and how it's affecting women throughout the migration journey and how it's different, we're looking at sexual and gender-based violence, and we're looking at what this means. So sexual and gender-based violence refers to any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships. Everything we just discussed. The structures and the lack of support in those structures for equality reinforce the vulnerabilities that exist. There's threats can include threats of violence, coercion, physical, psychological, sexual, denial of resources, and it can be inflicted on women, men, girls, and boys. So very, very, very quickly, I'm going to end off with this. I'm just going to go back to the migration journey that we talked about and sort of highlight what are some of the differing impacts for women. The very first piece of the migration continuum that I talked about was the pre-flight, so the armed conflict. What are women dealing with? In a situation of instability, often there's forced labor. There can be a threat to immediate safety, bombings, attacks, forced deportation, summary executions, racist state policies, limitations, reprisal for speaking up, limitations on healthcare, education, employment. All of this undoubtedly affects women, men, and children very differently. And sexual violence as a strategy of war. During flight, so the next piece. So this is when someone has fled. They may be crossing borders, for example. What can happen? Women are often subjected to sexual and economic exploitation, prostitution, early forced marriages, sexual harassment, touching, leering harassment. This is all very gender specific. In countries of first asylum, so in transit camps, where many often end up for a very long time, often women can face physical insecurity in facilities full of men. And this has been happening in the Syrian context when, for example, in Germany, there has been a disproportionate amount of men compared to women. There's unsegregated sanitary facilities, lack of lockable bedrooms, even advances and harassment by police and aid workers, trading sex for smuggling, debts for food, safety, and services. These are the realities that these women are facing at the beginning of their journey. Domestic violence, even within their family units. Amnesty International recently did publish a report on this, and they're saying that women and girls traveling alone and those accompanied only by their children felt particularly under threat in transit areas. And finally, in countries of resettlement. So even after having gone through all that, there is a violence piece that still exists. And some of it is physical and evidentiary, and some of it you can't see right away. And that's the trauma that's carried with the experiences, right? So there's trauma, there's discrimination. What does discrimination look like for a newly resettled women refugee who has experienced all the abuses along the way? What does discrimination look like? What does trauma look like? Discrimination can even come from, for example, language barriers or being the other. In Canada, we have been a little different, and I advocate this on a regular basis, that in Canada, our refugees are no longer refugees, they're newcomers and they are permanent residents. But that is not the rhetoric that is existing around the world right now. What does that entail for women? Domestic violence is very, very prevalent in newly resettled populations. Isolation, poverty, shame, barriers to accessing support. There could be full shelters in some countries. There's language barriers. People are afraid of asking for help from police because of the abuse they faced along the way. And in Canada, there was a recent study, and this falls in line with the shame, but more than 50% of refugee women who had been raped and 94% of refugee sex assault victims did not tell refugee workers of their experience. 94%. They were feared being labeled as prostitutes or losing refugee status on moral ground. This is the baggage that's carried. This is the reality that is existing. So, to end off, one thing that I think needs to be practiced, and it isn't, although it's preached, is effective gender mainstreaming. We still have a long way to go, even here in Canada. There is a distinction between, talking the talk and walking the talk. And a lot of it has to come from learning. And when we talk about gender transformation or gender mainstreaming, and I was talking earlier about the cultural shift, it's a process. And that needs to be a concerted effort. So when we talk about gender mainstreaming, we're often talking about gender integration versus gender transformation. When you have gender integrated, you have acknowledged the issue, and you're adding formal obligations, for example, into existing policy frameworks. But when it's gender transformative, which should be the goal, it transforms policy frameworks by introducing the new understandings. And when those are introduced and understood, then they can truly be put into practice. I'm going to end off with this one picture. So I don't know if you've seen this before. It's a pretty famous shot. It is a shot of the men who drafted the 1951 Convention on Refugees. It's the official legal document that defines what a refugee is at the UN and world stage. And I'm leaving you with a quote that's really interesting, and it is something to think about when we think about structures and reinforcement of structural issues and the dominance of the men and the male lens. So this is an academic that put this quote out, a human rights theorist, Bunch. She said, "The dominant definition of human rights and the mechanisms to enforce them in the world today are ones that pertain primarily to the types of violations that the men who first articulated the concept more feared. One of the main criticisms of the convention when applying a gender lens is gender and fear of persecution based on gender is not actually a grounds for fleeing within that legal framework." So I'll bring it back.
Thank you so much, Urooj. That was a great talk, and we really appreciate your time. And we have a few questions here if you have a bit of time to answer them.
Yeah.
You did mention, I'm not giving them in any order because I just kind of wanted to touch on one of the last points you had made about what needs to be done in that concerted effort in recognizing the distinct situations of refugee women. And you mentioned a bit about applying gender lens in policy and all that, but what can average citizens do in this case? How can they educate themselves? How can they become these allies or change the narrative in their own way?
I think one of the biggest things is to look around, like as an individual, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And I find that happens very often, like when you start critically looking at everything, you start thinking, oh, where am I going to start? But I would start with myself. Start one in your household. Look at the gender roles and norms that are taking place in their household and how you're living, for example, with the roles and expectations within. And then in terms of the advocacy, especially surrounding this issue, is, in Canada, we have the opportunity to have a voice, not even the opportunity, but it's a big, big tool. And so support organizations that are working on this. Go educate yourselves even more and see where you're working, for example. Canada does not have a gender equality department per se, or a policy. The status of women, we have that department. They're still working on developing that policy. I've lived and worked abroad in countries where they have set up entire departments, and it hasn't even happened here yet. And so it's important to recognize, one, what are the problems? Important for men, women, everybody sort of to look at society as a whole, and collaborate on recognizing each other's needs and issues and challenges and barriers. It's not just a female-oriented lens that needs to be, achieved by just the women. It's an everybody issue when we're talking about equality.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd very much agree with that, and we should be looking through that lens, everyone. So the next question we have is about the Women, Peace and Security agenda and how you see it applying to the issues of forced displacement. And I know you touched upon this a bit, so if you could elaborate a little more, I think, talk to us about that part.
Yeah, for sure. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda, just a really brief background. It was only in year 2000 that it was for the very first time, it was through UN Security Council Resolution 1325, that there was a really clear message sent that when we're talking about situations of peace and security and conflict, that women need to be highlighted in terms of their needs, in terms of their roles and agents of change, for example. And so when we talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it started with that landmark resolution. It was the first of its kind that put onto paper that there needs to be a thorough and concerted effort on acknowledging the other half. And so that agenda basically exists of a handful of resolutions that have come out throughout the years. For example, there's Resolution 1820 that put into writing that sexual violence is a tactic of war and what countries are obligated to do about it. The agenda actually functions on 4 premises or 4 pillars, thematic pillars, and that is participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery. So it has touch points where you can start focusing on where the women fit in. You know, for example, participation, their full participation in supporting conflict prevention and peace processes. You know, all the way from being at the table to being able to speak at the table and being heard at the table. It's not enough to just have someone checked off as being somewhere and being represented. And we've learned through experience that when you have everyone represented, that there is a likelihood of durable peace, because, you know, the roadmap has to be implemented by the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are the vulnerable that, you know, are the stakeholders of that country. Protection is a big pillar as well, and that I think we talked quite a bit about in this piece. And prevention of conflict and sexual and gender-based violence is a foundational piece of the gender, peace, and security agenda as well. So it's interesting because we try to connect the migration and the refugee issue with it quite a bit. And it's been an opportunity. And the reason I'll leave off with this, the reason it's such a landmark agenda is because it has been passed through the Security Council. And what that means is any state that is a member of the Security Council is not by choice, but obligated to realize the obligations that are stated in this agenda. So as a member state of the UN, when the UN Security Council passes a resolution, it is mandatory on states to make sure that those are realized. And that is part of the work that I've been doing for the last few years, is how then do you take these ideas or rules or commitments and turn them into action? In Canada, we have a national action plan. The second iteration of it was actually released last year. So it's progressed, and there are a handful of countries in the world right now, a handful, that have now released their second iteration of their national action plan. But that's sort of how we advocate as activists on the issue, is to put it into action. So you have this obligation. How do you put it into action? How do you make sure a gender lens is being applied to things like, for example, our national defense, or our humanitarian engagement on these issues, or our management of refugee commitments? All of this falls right into that agenda. And now we're held accountable on the world stage for what we're doing because we're obligated to as a result of that agenda.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for sharing that. The next question is, and you also touched upon that, I think someone needed a bit more elaboration, is that is gender-based violence only about women? So you had mentioned that it affects men, women, and children, especially in times of war, differently, and it's sometimes a very conscious strategy of war. So if you could elaborate more on that, and if you maybe have any numbers or anything that you want to share about certain, or examples, that would be great.
So the answer would be no, it's not just about women. You know, there can be men on men violence. And often, like, when sexual violence is used as a tactic of war, there's more to it than the actual assault that is taking place. For example, if a woman is being sexually assaulted, what happens then to her, the implication, for example, to her community or to her spouse, for example. Like, it's often used as a tactic because there's a shame element attached to it. It's often used as a tactic when you get really heavily into academic theory. It's often used as a tactic to demonstrate, you know, machoism or masculinity. But is it a women's only issue? No, it's a community issue. It can happen to men and boys. It doesn't just happen to women. It is used as a tactic, but it's also, I mean, it is a form of violence that's used for a variety of reasons, but it's not just a man issue. I can't speak to numbers per se because they're ever changing. And one of the biggest issues that we have with numbers and statistics on this is that it's very underreported. or even when the numbers do exist, for the longest time until recently, the issue was not even acknowledged, for example, as a refugee issue. You know, even here in Canada, we're bringing in, you know, I was working in the refugee resettlement area, but we're bringing in, for example, refugee women, and that element of, have you been assaulted? Are you coming with this trauma? Wasn't even part of the process in questioning. So even when we're taking care of these, like some of the most vulnerable in the world, we're not even sort of looking at the holistic sort of experience that they've had. So we're able to address the problems. But yeah, it's not just a women issue, and it's very hard to pin down. I mean, there's been quite a bit of reports of abuse and assault from a variety of actors. I sort of mentioned it a little bit in the presentation too. It's not just between, you know, people that are migrating. It's not just between warring parties. It can happen with the authorities while people are in transit. You know, there's cases, if you look at the recent exodus and the migration groups heading through Hungary, like the levels of abuse that the Hungarian authorities, you know, exercised against the women, and particularly sexual assault, is disturbing, and it's formal, right? At that point, it's formally acted, whether it's written down or not. I mean, you have a uniform on. It's a huge violation.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And thank you for sharing that and highlighting that. You did mention during the webinar that it was problematic to classify refugee women and children into one category. Why do you think that is?
So when we talk about vulnerable populations, we're talking about vulnerable populations, people in need, right? Facing threat to their security, facing threat to their self. But like we mentioned today, and what we talked about, is when you have differing groups, they have differing needs. So one main obvious reason that it's problematic is that the needs of children are different than the needs of women. The issues that children and the vulnerabilities that children have are very different from the vulnerabilities that an adult woman will have. The distinctions between even a girl child's issues and a boy child's can be different, right? It depends on context, so you can't, again, have a brush stroke over it. But the other problem is, and especially in the type of work that I've been doing, where we advocate for women, for example, in peace processes, when you equate women and children together, you're sort of throwing them in a category, or you're reinforcing stereotypes and oppression of women in a way where you're infantilizing them, and you're essentializing their roles. And when that happens, it also takes away, formally and informally, it takes away the idea that they are adults and they can have agency to forward, you know, issues as adults, or participants, as equal participants at the table, for example. So it's highly problematic because it sort of demeans the role that they can play in a variety of ways, and it also takes away from the specific needs assessment that needs to take place to address their safety issues.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that had never crossed my mind. So thank you for highlighting that part. Is that, yeah, grouping them together does, there are similarities, there are parallels, but it definitely does take away from the narrative of the women specifically, and putting them in a position where they are adults, where they are equals to other adults in the communities that they're in, and they need to be heard that way as well. And it doesn't minimize either the women or children's plight. So the last question we have here for today is if you can give an example or two of how service providers who work with these vulnerable communities, be it in the countries of origin, or the countries of transit, or even the countries of settlement, how they can apply the human security lens to the work that they're doing with these populations. An example or two, or maybe it just like what you think are the most important things for them to keep in mind for this.
I think there are some obvious ones which I've seen mispracticed here, for example, in Canada, one of the biggest things is cultural considerations. You know, there's different cultures of people arriving. There's different circumstances. And one of the reasons I talk about the continuum of violence, even from where I sit and from the experiences I've had within the system, is that there is a lack of acknowledgement here, for example, in resettlement, that there is all this baggage that comes of trauma and experience that comes along with an individual. When they're here, they're not starting fresh. You know, it's a fact, and in Canada it has been studied, that there is increased domestic violence within refugee communities, and within the households immediately upon arrival. And it's usually violence against women. And why is that, right? So the trauma isn't just for the females when we're talking about sexual and gender-based violence, it's with the men too. You know, and if you practice in the area of gender-based violence, you can sort of just even look at the textbook reasons. For example, there's frustration from, you know, losing identity. There's frustrations from not being able to earn the way you used to, or even just settling is such a stressful experience no matter where you are. And that applies to, I mean, the in-transit touch point as well. You're not in control, and what kind of frustrations does that reveal out of an individual? And you know, oftentimes there's violence associated with that because it's the only way they can get it out. Is it okay? No. But is it a fact? Yeah. And so I think one of the areas that needs a lot of attention is really sitting down and having an assessment of what was the experience. And then on the complementary side of it is having resources allocated to deal with those soft realities, soft in policy terms, because they're not really recognized in a lot of our practice as checks on where you can get funding, for example, or areas that need to be addressed for you know, well-being and effective integration, for example. So that would be one, is to do really thorough assessments on the journey, and really highlight the psychological trauma that comes with it. I think if the psychological trauma piece is addressed, it will lead to a healthier, you know, goal and an achievement at the end for all of these individuals. The big piece.
Thank you. That was very insightful and very helpful. And with that, we're coming to the end of the webinar. And we thank you so much for your time. It has been a very, very interesting topic that needs to be addressed, that needs to be discussed. There are many subtopics within this subject that we can go into so much more depth in, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do that in the future. And for those of you watching this, if in any way that you feel like you need to take a break and take care of yourself for a minute or two or more, please do. We understand this is a very heavy topic and could be potentially triggering to some people. So thank you so much, Urooj, for your time. We really appreciate it, and we hope to be hearing more of you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.